Hi there, and welcome to the Ora Report. And today I'm extremely honored to host Ian Thornton-Trump, the inimitable Ian Thornton-Trump, cybersecurity expert and international speaker. And it's a great honor to have Royce de Melo for the first time. Royce has got an incredible background. He has been based in the Middle East. I'm not sure if you're there right now, mainly in Cairo, and worked in various capacities in several countries, including the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central America, both as a journalist and in security management. He knows a lot about unconventional warfare and terrorism, and he writes incredible reports on LinkedIn. So thank you both for joining us. Ian, let me start with you. What
Okay.
do you think? What is going on?
Well, yeah, I mean, what isn't going on right now? I think there's sort of the backdrop at a global level right now is the tariffs on again, off again, deals, or lack thereof. It appears also that the Trump government is having a difficulty in executing any sort of coherent policy. And then what we're seeing, I think, playing out on the global scale is the aggressive rise and influence of China as sort of filling a void. One of the big headlines, Royce, I don't know if you saw this one, was the shutting down of Voice of America. In place of that has been Chinese networks taking up that challenge and that torch so that, basically now there's sort of only one sort of voice, if you will, um, that is aligned to the Chinese policymakers, especially in Africa, specifically where I think Voice of America was primarily targeted as a soft power. And then also within that context, I think it's really important to understand that the State Department of the United States is massively downsizing. I've heard the figure of 1,300 foreign service officers are going to be eliminated. To be fair, when you think about what a foreign service officer is, an FSO, they have a bit of a trail in terms of support functions. Like they're not sort of an independent thing that just shows up. There's a bunch of other analysts and State Department people and logistics support. And that's actually kind of how I would get Royce involved in the conversation because he's been there, he gets that, he understands it. My question to Royce then to kick us off really is, Royce, how big a deal is it with America's pullback at the State Department level for the areas that you cover?
I would agree with what you were saying regarding that the FSOs serve many functions. And for Voice of America to be also removed, bad policy in my opinion. The Chinese are very good at propaganda, so are the Russians. The Russians are experts in propaganda, in my opinion. But these foreign dignitaries work in so many ways, including intelligence. I mean, it's not an official capacity intelligence, but they will gather information that's pertinent through their capacities. I just think the entire idea is bad for the U.S., bad for the West, actually. And well, beyond that, I don't know what to say. And it does have an effect in the regions that I deal with, in the Middle East and Africa, especially, where many do look to the United States as this crowning example of democracy and freedom, the experiment that is America. And I think it just reflects really badly at the end of the day. And that's my opinion on the matter. But there you have it.
So what's top of mind for you right now, Royce? What are you thinking about, and what are sort of the major areas that you're exploring in your sort of your writings and your analysis?
I'm right now mainly focused on both Africa and the Middle East, as you know, but I'm looking at what's happening in Syria with Shara, aka Golani or Jolani, depending on what Arabic you're speaking, and the situation, of course, in the Middle East as a whole: Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, Iran. Um, and then in Africa, of course, with the terrorism in the Sahel and in Mozambique. It's related in its way, but they're far removed. Um, looking at the situation in the Sahel, the Mediterranean basin is right there. And we have these migrants showing up on the shores. I'm sure that there are a number of terrorist cells that have washed up on the shores of Europe at this point. With Syria, Shada, I don't think we should trust him. His background speaks for itself.
Less
And
scary ISIS.
yeah, that's one way to put it. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I just commented the other day about how, or was it yesterday, how Shada is in power and the Alawites were being massacred. Some Christians were being killed. Some of them by Uyghur terrorists who
That's
were
right.
extremists. So the Uyghurs are these victims in China, but yet here we have a unit of Uyghur Islamist extremists who were at the forefront of killing Christians and Alawites. But there was a recent Reuters report that indicates that even though Shada said that they did this unilaterally, he couldn't control them or stop them, or he tried to stop them, the report indicates it went right to the top. That
Yeah,
this,
and you know what? It's fascinating because I think, in the Ora Report, there was a discussion around the Druze, and the Druze are present in Syria, and they were recently, I think, pressed, or there was a situation where the Bedouin, um, and the Druze kind of went at each other, and that is sort of beyond the Bashar al-Assad, sort of like folks holding on to the last strings of of their former
Assad.
government, right?
Mhm.
The Assad regime. So my question, I think, really is, you've got um, Israel carving out a chunk of Syria as a buffer zone. You've got the Turks apparently declaring victory over the YPG and KKP in Kurdistan, right? Iran's footprint in Iraq massively withdrawing. Is Syria, like, basically now an opportunity space? Or what do you think the end game is there? Because I'm really puzzled by how many different kind of, I'm going to say, Middle East powers can actually get involved in Syria.
In the case of Syria is a mystery to me because you have Trump now opening relations basically with them and lifting sanctions. And you've got all these European countries, including the Ukrainians, who ran over to meet with Shada after the fall of Damascus. Everyone was trying. I think they're trying to somehow appease him and at the same time bring them into their arena and to somehow influence him because he's playing the part of the moderate. He's put a tie on. Islamists don't wear ties. so, so while this is happening, you've also got the Saudis, because remember when Trump first met Shada, it was in Saudi Arabia with the crown prince there. So there's this bending over backwards. And I think the West has an arrogance to think they can manipulate him and influence him in a way that can bring him into a very moderate Islamic governing force. And I have my doubts. He may play the part, do some sort of what I call divine deception, which is sanctioned, by the way, and to bring in this Western relations, what have you, until one day he feels strong enough to do what he needs to do, or whoever follows Shada into power, who's probably going to be an Islamist as well, and will do what they need to do. By the way, the YPG right now is getting together to take on the HTS at
Yeah.
this very moment.
Huh.
So the civil war is not done. And what
No.
you mentioned about the Druze, I don't know if you know, but the Druze of Israel the men are conscripted.
Mhm.
They fight for the IDF. A lot of them work with border police. So they used to work a lot with border police. So the Druze are Arabs who are loyal to Israel. The Druze of Syria who are loyal to Syria. The Druze of Lebanon, well, they're kind of loyal to themselves. I think it was Wally Jumblatt is still the head of the Druze in Lebanon, and they were a faction in the war during the Civil War. And then you have the Golan Heights, which, by the way, footnote, the Golan Heights have seen in recent years many they're Syrian citizens of these Druze who have been applying for Israeli citizenship. And it was a small percentage, and kind of quietly they were doing it. But now, after the fall of Syria, I think they're all applied. So They're all going, yeah, we want to be Israeli citizens. We got it good here. In the meantime, the Druze in Syria have actually made these relations, well, a portion of the Druze have made relations with Israel, where Israel said they will defend the Druze in Syria. So the HTS and whatever have kind of been holding off on taking on the Druze. But the Israelis have said they would protect minorities. Will they do a buffer zone? At this point, I don't think they want to. I don't know if they will, because they have enough on their plate.
Yeah,
And
they're a little busy.
yeah. So the buffer zones, look, Israel was in southern Lebanon for a long time before they pulled out. And I remember an Israeli telling me one of the reasons why they pulled out is because they realized the buffer zone was just draining, and it wasn't as effective as they thought it would be. And at the time, they had the South Lebanese army as an ally who was fighting Hezbollah as well. So I don't know if Israel wants to do that. They may, I think right now there is a slight buffer right now going on of some kind, but I don't think in the long run they want to do that. And but I don't see Shada opening relations with Israel either. He's not been very open about that.
No, that might be a step too far. Let's get re-involved in the conversation, because I feel like, hey, this is the Ora Report, so we got to hear from you. Now, you would be characterized as saying, beware of Islamists bearing gifts. Right?
Yeah,
Because
that's good. Yeah.
why don't you kind of give us your perspective as you see these Islamic organizations, including now sort of, shall we say, a defanged version of Iran, trying to because Iran has basically been, bombed and curtailed its behavior, and I think world stage posture has been significantly eroded. Does nature abhor an Islamic vacuum? And are there now other groups parachuting in that? Rio, go ahead.
When we're talking about Iran, I think we have to be very specific to Iran and stick to that with them and their proxies. The Houthis are still a problem. They sunk that ship the other day.
2 of them.
And I'm wondering at this point how much control Iran has over the Houthis. They may not have. You have this dynamic in any relationship where they may not have the control that they think they have. And the
Weren't
Houthis
they originally fighting for an independent carve out of Yemen?
Yes.
Like they were fighting the government of Yemen that was backed by Saudi.
Yeah.
And so I guess Iran started giving them that money because Iran is pretty much anti-Saudi.
Well, all the Houthis are Shia.
Okay. All right.
So here, at the very core of this matter in Yemen is it's the Sunni Shia Islamic civil war, or a civil war within Islam. Let me say, it's a 1400-year-old civil war. It's never going to stop until one side thinks they're going to win. The problem is the Shia think they're going to win one day because they believe in the return of this 12th Imam, the Mahdi. And when he returns, there's going to be a great war, and then the world will be utopian and Islamic. So they think they have the rights of Islam, but they have it right. In the meantime, you have the Sunni, of course, who think they have it right. And the Saudis are the protectors of the holy sites, Mecca, Medina, what have you. And so at the core of this is this religious conflict and belief. And the hatred is, like I said, it goes back 1400 years since the death of Muhammad. It's not going to go away. So with this in mind, and as I wrote in my blog a couple of weeks ago, in Iran, the Ayatollahs and the Imams, their whole raison d'etre is this belief: the destruction of Israel, the destruction of the West, destroy America, destroy the UK. I mean, Khomeini had said the other day, on a video I think it was from last year, where he says when they chant, death to Israel, death to the UK, death to America, this is policy.
Yeah.
It's policy. This is not some, rhetoric, but this is what people underestimate is belief as a motivator for conflict or for bad behavior or for whatever motive. It's a motive. Belief is a motive. It's not always economic. Look, Iran wants to sell its oil. It wants to sell its resources. It's under sanctions. If they just behaved and played nice, those sanctions would be lifted, but they don't. And they're trying to build nuclear bombs. For what reason? To destroy Israel, to wipe a nation off the face of the earth, because they actually believe in this quasi end times prophecy that they want to self-fulfill. And on top of that, you've got this strong horse mentality where within the Middle East, amongst the Arabs and Iranians, they respect the strong horse. So when Trump hit those nuclear facilities, I'm going to say it's the language the Iranians understand. They respect that. There's a level of respect on that. It's like, oh, he's not playing games. But remember when he took out Soleimani in Baghdad, they already learned a lesson on that one. It was like, okay, he doesn't play games. And this is understanding, as I always say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Understand the culture, understand the mentality that goes with that. And you have to play, because the West likes to project Obama and Biden with the nuke deals with Iran while they were still building. They didn't stop building what they were doing. They didn't stop trying to enrich uranium. And they got billions in return from Obama that the Americans released. And of course, where did the money go? It went to Hezbollah, Hamas. And yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you more about that, Royce, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Mhm.
So I kind of start on a first tier of what would be, where would the great powers clash? And that's where I took religion and ideology out of it. But I agree with you that the issue of these messianic types of thinking, and I don't think it's only the Shia that have got this messianic ideology with the Mahdi, who's apparently, you'll be able to correct me, he is their Messiah. He's been in occultation. He cannot come out of occultation until they are killing Jews or they've killed every last Jew. So there's definitely a very bizarre messianic aspect to them. And this I've also seen in Russia. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I actually wrote about this in my blog about 2 years ago, I think, where there was an actual official policy document from Pravda. I saw it in TASS, where they said the Russian Orthodox Church is the only defender of Christianity. Everyone else is a heathen, barbarian, and Satanist. And they have this very messianic aspect, which is why I don't think Russia is backing down or will back down. Your comments, Royce?
That's interesting. I'd forgotten about the Russian Orthodox Church. Look, I think the Russian Orthodox Church is the Russian Orthodox Church. And what I mean to say by that is it is a national church. It is the nationalist church.
Capital R Russia, small
Yes.
O for Orthodox.
Yeah. It serves, I think in this case, within the Russian Orthodox Church, I think many of them are just serving Putin's purposes. While I think there's probably a mix or an element of nationalism mixed with serving Putin, or just nationalism. And it's, again, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's the mentality. Russians are very proud and nationalistic people. So, and the church follows that. It's just it's human nature. I mean, and to think that they're the church is kind of, well, I think it's rich considering there's so many other Orthodox churches that exist, and other churches that have been around for 2,000 years, longer than the Orthodox churches. But yeah, I think it's just nationalism mixed with serving Putin's interests. I don't know if Putin himself is that religious, to be honest.
I think he would find religion if it was convenient politically.
I agree. I think going by his past as a Soviet agent and a specialist, he's probably of an atheist mindset, or at least agnostic. But he's Machiavellian. He'll use whatever he can for his purposes. For the purpose
I
of
will just say that I have seen quite a few images of Putin being very conspicuous at Orthodox services and making a point of being seen to celebrate Easter and so on. So he's definitely, that is very much part of his agenda. And I also observed that remember I've spoken to you about running Geopolitics group. A lot of Russians have got that sort of messianic sort of fervor about them in the sense that what we are doing, we have to do this. So we do support him because there is the Satanism in the West. They are trying to
Yeah,
impose
good
all of
point.
these ideologies
Yeah.
on us. But we need to protect ourselves and the world, actually.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I've seen these videos from a while back where they were showing, it was comedic videos of a Russian couple going to the United States on a plane. I don't know if you saw those videos where there was, for example, some white people on the plane were bowing down to an African American, and they're like, "What are you doing?" It's like, "Oh, because we feel guilty," and what have you. And then on the plane, they meet somebody who's an LGBTQ person, and all these incidents. And the point of these little short comedy clips were to show how, in their opinion, how messed up the West is, and how they are, like you said, satanic in their way, and we're fighting the good fight for old morals and old standards.
And on that note, Royce, this is underscored by the wide held spread belief in Russia that Ukraine is a bunch of fascists. Right? Even though there is a small, I would say, minority that is pro right wing, Ukraine nationalism, but the country has gone through a tremendous rebranding exercise since the 2022 invasion. In that, the reason they were part of NATO or Europe was they failed to apply even a modicum of anti-corruption and government sort of like responsibility and whatnot, right? And now, there are bulwark against a Russian expansionism. And I found it really interesting that all of that sort of issues that were present prior to sort of the G7 and European engagement in the war were sort of forgotten completely. And I feel like this is the European superiorism of, listen, patriotism is finding somebody else to die for your country passionately to protect you, right? Um, but I think on the other side of it, Russia, I worry that the damages that have been inflicted to their economy and their population in terms of population demographics, with more than 1 million casualties now. Do you feel that this is like an existential threat to Russia, where we could see more breakaway republics, or do you feel like the center will hold, so Russia will hold?
I don't think it's an existential threat to Russia. No. Um, Within the Federation, it's been calm. There are the Islamists that were occurring over in Chechnya and those areas. And ironically, they're Chechen mercenaries who've been fighting for Russia and Ukraine. Also, there's been Chechens who fighting on Ukraine's side. Yeah. So, but no, I don't think there's an existential threat to Russia. Not at all. I think a lot of these Russian federations nowadays are okay with being part of Russia, are loyal to Russia. But who knows? Something could kick off again. Ukraine, but about what you were saying, like there was the Azov battalion, which was associated with neo-Nazis and what have you. And to be honest, I mean, some of these men who've been captured or killed, they've got the swastikas tattooed on them and what have you, especially back in the early days. But like you said, there's been this rebranding where Azov is not a neo-Nazi battalion anymore, or wasn't, or isn't. But the Russians aren't giving up on that. They're still playing on that propaganda that these are neo-Nazis and fascists. And yet, ironically, you have Zelensky, who's Jewish, who's running the country. And which, by the way, footnote, remember when our parliament brought somebody who fought for the Nazis in Ukraine to our parliament? And Zelensky applauded, he's standing beside, this is a side note, standing beside Trudeau. And so when they said, oh, here's somebody who fought the Russians in World War II from Ukraine, it was like, well, yeah, if anybody knew their history, they would have went, whoa, wait a minute. Russia was our ally. And so if you know your history, you knew that there were these Nazi Ukrainian battalions that were fighting the Galicians, I think, or whatever they were called, who were fighting the Soviets. And on top of that, Zelensky was applauding, but you couldn't see his face. You'd think he would have tugged at Trudeau's sleeve and said, well, wait a minute.
That's enough. This is what you get when you get a 19-year-old policy major who has a degree in political studies, right? Like, oh yeah, this is going to be a great photo op. No.
Yeah, and there's something I have to say. the Conservative Party, there was not one person who stayed seated and said, this is not someone to applaud for.
Yeah.
Even the Conservatives, the Tories stood up. Every single one of them applauded. It just shows you the state of affairs in Canada where we just don't know, or in the West in general, people don't know history. They just don't.
Let's move into Africa again, because I think you've been doing some great work in sort of uncovering Russian mercenaries. And my question to you is, and it's probably the answer is it's complicated, Ian, but are these mercenaries is money getting kicked back to Russia, or are these basically Russian deserters that have now set up guns for hire type of operation? Does it have I guess the easy way of asking is, does it have a connection back to the mothership?
100%.
Oh, really? Okay.
Wagner Group, when it was created by Prigozhin and Utkin,
Yeah.
and they named it Wagner Group, when they were first created, and you remember there was the taking of Crimea back in 2014, and they had the green men, the little green men were
Yeah.
Wagner Group. They had
That's
no patches or anything to identify them. So initially it gave Russia plausible deniability. The Russians like playing on nuance and vagueness, and it's about making things complicated to pinpoint Russia, to blame them for everything. So Wagner had its use when it went into Crimea, and then later on with the war in the East, the Civil War, and Donbass, in those areas. A lot of those men that were fighting were not locals, but Wagner mercenaries. And Putin also apparently had sent some Soviet troops, not Soviet, Russian troops in under the guise of being locals or volunteers that were helping the cause in the East. But they are, the best way to describe them, Wagner Group, is it is a hybrid private military company.
Okay.
What's key, it's hybrid, because it was directly serving Putin. It was considered Putin's private army. It serves the Kremlin. It didn't do anything without the Kremlin's permission. It was attached to the MOD, but officially not.
Okay.
That's why it's best described as a hybrid, because Wagner Group eventually became a holding company. It had mining companies and other companies. It had an office apparently in Hong Kong even. So they'd opened up into all sorts of other businesses that people don't realize, including resources,
Casinos,
especially
pies, steaks, universities.
I don't know. What I mainly saw was a lot of resources,
Right.
like
Yeah.
mining operations and what have you. They had these shell companies that were doing things. But so Prigozhin had, again, the Wagner Group served the Kremlin's purposes. It was Putin's private army. So instead of sending Russian troops into, for example, Mali, you send the private military company. It's perfect. It serves the purpose. And that way, if anybody gets killed, they're not Russian soldiers.
Right.
And these are contractors, mercenaries, whatever you want to call them. In the CAR, where they are now, same thing, where they first went. Syria, the Battle of Hesam, I think that was the battle's name. But
American Special Forces versus Russia.
The thing that people should understand is the Americans had a line of contact to the Russian military in Syria, so that they wouldn't confront each other. So the Americans were constantly contacting their point of contact with the Russians. Are there Russian soldiers there? Well, this attack was happening. And they were, by the way, it's interesting that when the Wagner did this attack, they were with Afghan and Pakistani Shia militias who were volunteers. So anyways, the Americans kept calling it in. The Russians said, no, there are no Russian soldiers there, which is a fact. There were no Russian soldiers. These are Wagner mercenaries. So there's a disassociated, they become handy. Yeah. So yeah, and they got whacked pretty hard. By the way, footnote on that, Prigozhin's problem with Shoigu, who was the chief of the Ministry of Defense, was because of that battle. That was the final straw. Yes, because before this battle happened, Prigozhin had been asking for anti-aircraft systems, weapons systems. And Shoigu never gave them, and he kept asking and asking and asking. When this battle happened, they got the shellacking that they did, where they estimate 200 to 300 Russians were killed. That's when he lost his temper with Shoigu. And that's why during the Battle of Bakhmut, he was a big mouth. Oh, we're not getting the artillery we want. We haven't got the weapons we want, blah, blah, blah. And just damning Shoigu publicly. And at the time, I remember saying maybe Putin has him on a chain and wants him to make Shoigu look bad because Putin wasn't getting along with Shoigu anyway because of it. We don't know, but he was pretty bold about it. He didn't. And then there was the mutiny that happened. And his target was to take Shoigu out. That was his goal. It wasn't about Putin. He considers himself, Prigozhin considered himself a friend. It was like, I'm going to show you some hard love to get rid of Shoigu. So what's interesting for me, in my opinion, is when he did this mutiny and then they stopped. And Wagner technically was getting disbanded, sent to Belarus and what have you. I think Shoigu, I think Putin was about ready to fire Shoigu. But once this mutiny happened and Shoigu was the problem and Prigozhin's trying to make his point, think how Putin would think.
I'm just going to solve the problem.
Putin couldn't fire him right away.
Yeah.
Because it would show that, Prigozhin was right. It's about alpha males, right? He's going to be the top. Now he put himself in a position where now I can't fire Shoigu. I have to keep him on a while longer. So it doesn't look like I've capitulated what Prigozhin did. And then Prigozhin fell from the sky. And then
because apparently they were given a grenade to play with on takeoff or something like that.
Or something. But then if you go to Africa, what happened, and there's a lot of discussion over this, the title, the Africa Corps, was not official until a couple months ago or whatever it was, when they said, okay, now the Africa Corps is taking over from Wagner. I think a lot of people don't understand how these things work, where Wagner was answering to the Ministry of Defense anyway. And by keeping them in Africa, I kept them away from Russia, because at this point, of course, Putin doesn't want them lingering around Russia anymore. It's an embarrassment. And they've mutinied. So make them case-specific to Africa operations. So they're still answering to the Ministry of Defense. And some people said, but they're not officially the Africa Corps. No, maybe officially they weren't designated that, but whoever's running the Africa Corps now were the same people who were running Wagner, in my opinion, after Prigozhin died and was taken out. So it's just the same people. Some have been arguing it's not a rebranding. I said, no, tantamount it is a rebranding. And I'd predicted this too. They were going to rebrand it. On a podcast with Phil Gursky, I had said that before it happened. He said, anyway. So it's a rebranding in the operation zone. So that way it's not, the Wagner name is kind of put aside. But it's like Eric Prince's Blackwater.
Yeah.
He's got the company Constellus now, but nobody calls it Constellus.
No, they still call it Blackwater.
Eric Prince Blackwater.
Like Twitter and X, right?
Well, exactly. It's the same sort of thing. So officially, the Africa Corps is now taking over operations, but the people who took over from Prigozhin, it's the same people. It is a rebranding, and I will argue until somebody proves me otherwise that it is a rebranding. But they were running the show, so it makes it convenient to keep them there. There are apparently Wagner people in Venezuela, so probably still under that name, but again, of course, different people are running it, but they still answer directly to the GRU and the Ministry of Defense. They control it. They run it. That's why a hybrid PMC is the best term to use.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So,
that's very interesting. Royce, I wonder, looking at Russia and China and Iran and the situation, in Syria, it just appeared that the Russian troops melted away as HTS came in. What do you make of that?
At that point, I think it was a matter of resources and practicality. There was no point. I mean, they were moving very quickly. The juggernaut was there, and the Syrian army was running away. They're falling apart. So why would the Russians fight at that point?
This was I think a less messy retreat, very much along the same lines as Afghanistan, where the Russians were not interested in fighting. They were interested in, again, having somebody else do the fighting for them. And when they realized that they could suddenly arrive on the front lines, keep in mind that Syria was being used as like a R&R location for Russian units that had gotten pasted in the Ukraine war. And so a lot of the units there were like not, I would call them, tier 2 or even tier 3. They were being reconsolidated unit. And so they were only too anxious to leave as soon as they realized that their sanctuary, if you were, from the Ukrainian war, was about to be overrun by at least half a dozen different groups. And that was the other thing, ranging from anyone supporting the former Assad regime will be lined up and shot against the wall as quickly as possible. So I think the Russians did a threat risk assessment and went, this is way too chaotic for us. And again, you want to talk about how World War II, or maybe the story of Syria, is how we avoided World War III by the skin of our teeth. Because what would have happened if the Turks had pushed all the way down and started engaging Russian units, right? At that point, you have NATO, arguably in the form of Turkey, battling it out with Russian troops in Syria with a dozen or more different groups with their own agendas. I mean, that right there is, that's almost like, and I think we're all old enough to realize the plot here, but that's like a Tom Clancy movie of somebody's worst nightmare. What do you think, Royce? Like,
I think the Turks again have channels with the Russians. I don't think they would want to conflict with each other. They seem to keep to their own zones. They notify movements and what have you. In the meantime,
they
you have
bought some gear too.
yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. True. Yeah, those missile systems. Yes. Well, yeah. Anyway, the Americans have their base in Syria, and they're working with the Kurds as well. So it's a soup. But I agree with most of what you said. I think the Russians just went, this isn't going to go well. It's a juggernaut. They're moving quickly. The Syrian army is retreating. They saw the writing on the wall that this wasn't worth it. And in the end, look what they ended up doing. They're talking to Shara as well and his government about reinstating the Russian naval base. So everyone's knocking on Shara's door and trying to get them into their sphere of influence.
Remind me. I was
John,
just going to
sorry.
Sorry, you go.
No, I just wanted to, am I understanding this correctly? So they are trying to get back into their water base in Syria, the Russians.
Yes, they've been talking to
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, just to show you.
I think that's a strategic move because you know who they don't want there? They don't want China putting the Belt and Road Initiative into that little piece of the world, because I think almost that would be, the Russians would lose complete geographical influence around Africa if that were to occur. So I think they need to hold on to that base in Syria.
Well,
otherwise, they lose that power protection.
Well, it's strategic. I mean, the Russians have been in Syria for decades as the Soviet Union and post Cold War, and it's the eastern part of the Mediterranean basin. It's a very strategic point. I mean, they have now in Libya under Haftar, they now have naval access as well. I don't know if they've yet formally established a naval base, but arms and things are going through Libya, eastern Libya, into Mali, what have you. It's a drop-off point into Mali, into their allies, Burkina Faso, and into their allies in Sahel for
because
arms.
Africa needs more guns. I think that's absolutely.
Yeah, but it's going to their government allies. But it looks serious strategic. But it's interesting. It fascinates me how these things work. That they're talking to a former enemies and saying, "Okay, can we have a base now? Could you give us?" And they're probably waving a carrot in front of him, like everyone else. In front of him, I'm meaning Shada, like everyone else is waving carrots in front of him.
And they're not afraid. They're not afraid to show up with briefcase full of cash, because there's sort of no, I'm going to say, artificial trade restriction from anti-bribery and corruption laws.
Yeah. Like I said, the Russians can be very Machiavellian. As I've said often, this goes back to Wagner Group now, the Africa Corps, is about Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. I always say this: never borrow or accept gifts from the mafia. Kind of what was said earlier. It's because once you're in their pocket, I firmly believe it's hard to get out of. And Mali, I think, Goita, the president there, is completely in Putin's pocket at this point with the arms shipments and the war efforts. And they're paying for it in resources and concessions. This is what the PMC gets. They get those concessions. Same thing with Burkina Faso is different. Traore there has had like a Praetorian Guard of Russians, not full armies fighting as far as I know to this point. But again, he's receiving equipment. Funny, Russia needs equipment for its war effort in Ukraine, but they seem to be providing enough to other countries as needed, including Niger.
Yeah. Well, even an old tank in Africa is a really impressive and dangerous thing, right? Like that's the reality is if it may not work on the Ukrainian front lines, that old 1960s, 1970s gear will be effective, in a mechanized unit in Africa when your opposition is flip-flops and RPGs, right? So
Right.
it's really like a scale thing. But I want to move on to one particular topic that I've been dying to explore with both of you, right? So um not to be lost in this whole African story between, China, Iran, and Russia is America. And America clumsily led an initiative in the Democratic Republic of Congo to secure a minerals for security deal, right? Now, this apparently was a gong show because there was like a shooting and there was proxies, including a Green Beret and an ex-diplomat that just sort of showed up in Kinshasa with a direct message from Trump, like, let's do a deal. Okay, so people get arrested. The American envoys get arrested, and then a deal is reached with sort of that includes their release, right? But the broader effort here was the Congolese president commuted the Americans to sentences, and then a peace deal was announced between Congo and Rwanda. Like, is this ball of catastrophe? Like, is it one of these things where if you keep rolling the ball, eventually, like, something sticks to it and it works? It boggles my mind that it is that weird. Uh, like, just not straightforward. But apparently now we have peace amongst Congo and Rwanda and US access to vital minerals. So what, winning?
Nobel Peace Prize, guys. Royce, what do you say?
To be honest with you, I don't know the story about this Green Beret showing up. I remember there's that attempted coup by that American Congolese and his son and those other couple white Americans who
Yep.
have been released, but I don't know that story.
Yeah, that was all part of this apparently diplomatic mission. There was a late night shooting incident. There was
I don't
all
know
sorts of
about
bizarre.
this.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is this sort of American strategic foreign policy to try and get the mineral wealth of Africa from the DRC. And wasn't there also a mention that the DRC is one of the countries that Trump will pay people to keep prisoner in? Because I know they were talking about extradition of folks to is it South Sudan and Somalia that were on the list as well?
That I don't know.
Or am I having a fever dream? I might be having
I
a fever dream.
I don't know about that. I can talk about the peace deal, the
Yeah,
Rwanda
do it.
DRC deal. Trump, whenever he does these peace deals, always comes, and this is not out of the ordinary anyway, comes with these economic and financial benefits and aid packages and what have you. It's what he does. Now, this war with M23 in the Congo, which is backed by Rwanda, of course, and there are Rwandan troops inside the Congo. Some of them covertly pretend to be rebels. It needed. I'll say it needs to happen. This peace deal, but Kagame, I have a lot of nice things to say about him, about the president of Rwanda. He's Machiavellian, where he chases opposition worldwide to take them out. if you might remember in Canada not too long ago, an RCMP officer was arrested for espionage who happens to be Rwandan. And he was compiling a list of Rwandan opposition here in Canada.
Wow.
So this is the
Chilling.
reach. This is how far he will go to get what he wants, to do what he wants. He's Machiavellian in his way. So anyway, I think the deal is a good idea. The idea of course, with the interest, the trade interests, the resource interests, this should benefit the Congo as well, because they will get access to what America needs is resources, and he wants to bring industry back to the United States. It helps push the Chinese out, especially. It keeps them at bay. But I don't know if you know, but Eric Prince, prior to this peace deal, already got a contract with the government to protect border areas and mining.
How convenient.
In Africa.
So Eric Prince got the contract, but here's the thing: he got the contract before this deal happened. It was already in talks before Trump was even elected. So it's interesting that it's convenient. But I think it's convenient. I just think it's just a coincidence. So now you've got Eric Prince setting up shop in the Congo with some of his men. He's been recruiting a lot of Francophone speaking people to go work these operations. I don't know where they're at this point.
I think Rwanda, the French language is the dominant language, not English or any.
Yep, for both countries.
For both countries, okay.
Both countries. So we'll see where this is going to go. I don't hold a lot of faith, because already the government of some people in the government, including Kagame's, talking about how the peace won't hold. So if they're already saying this and they just signed the paper, ink hasn't even dried.
This isn't going to work.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, sorry, go ahead.
How much of this is being influenced by covertly by Russia and China and Iran, which seems to have exported terrorism to every country in Africa? Can you give us any idea of how much of it is sort of internal and how much is coming from these rival great powers trying to maintain access to resources, basically?
I know the Russians from 3 years ago. I won't divulge much more than that, but I was in meetings in Africa, and I know the Russians were trying to set up shop within the Congo to do also what Eric Prince is going to do now. I know they were knocking on the door. The Chinese, of course, they're all over Africa, needless to say. They're trying to get resources. They're hands off on getting involved in conflicts. The Russians are more willing to get involved in conflicts. So the Congo right now under President Iran, within Rwanda and the Congo, it's possible. I just don't know of anything.
I have a note on that I can share. So, and Iran is honestly the least of the worries in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because an Islamic State group, they call themselves the Allied Democratic Forces, conducted a massacre of 66 civilians there. So, basically they get Islamic State. Yay! And as you probably know, Iran actually was hunting ISIS people. So the Western press over here, in a lot of cases, tried to put a link between Iran and ISIS. And to be fair, Iran, the size of dicks that they are, looks at ISIS as an even worse problem, right? So there is a problem of Islamicism in Democratic Republic of Congo on top of all the other problem. But like Africa, it's a bit nebulous, because this ADF group originated in Uganda, back in 2019. So they're sort of spreading their territorial wings as well. So all of these things, it's province to province. In places like Nigeria, the security situation is so dynamic, and one day it's peaceful and everything like that, and the next day 4 villages are set on fire and there's mortar rounds being exchanged. It's just so impossible to point the finger on the map. I think one of the only places that is very stable is Nairobi these days, and Kenya. Kenya specifically. In fact,
it had an incident.
Yeah. But incidentally, they were just voted best place in Africa to deploy a data center. So, this is such, I think, a contrast, and we don't understand the regional security situation in Africa to the extent that, how I think dynamic it is. Royce, do you think that's accurate to say it's incredibly dynamic and borders are sort of amorphous things?
Yes, I would agree with that. Going back to the ADF, they're an ISIS affiliate.
Yeah.
They're ISIS Central Africa. And remember, I told you Sunni and Shia divide?
Yeah.
The civil war within Islam. Yeah, they're not. They're Sunni. They're not.
Yeah.
Look, ISIS in Syria and Iraq, if they caught civilians even who were Shia or Alawite,
Yeah.
they'd kill you.
Yeah.
They would just kill you because you're Shia.
Yeah.
So that in Africa, yeah, the ADF is ISIS, but there is a lot of Iranian businesses and monkey business going on in Africa. I remember in Angola seeing these companies that were dealing in cars, used cars and car sales, and there were a lot of them were Shia Lebanese.
Right.
And I know for a fact because I won't say much more, except in Ghana as well, where I've been, there are operations like this as well, and a lot of them are tied to Hezbollah. So they're fronts for Hezbollah. I know this throughout Africa in certain countries. The DRC, I don't know if they have a presence there. Nairobi's have been having protests in the street and some political issues lately, and they've had some big terrorist attacks from Al Shabaab. You might remember the mall some years ago. So it's not that safe, and then crime is also an issue. But yeah, well, anyways, going back to the DRC and Rwanda, I don't know if this peace is going to hold. And you have to remember that despite this peace deal with Rwanda, in the meantime, you have numerous rebel groups that have nothing to do with Rwanda.
Right. Yeah.
Related to tribalism and just weird cult movements and what have you. And they're not going away until they're killed off or disarmed. I mean, I forget how many rebel groups are fighting within the DRC, unrelated to the Rwanda tribal issues.
And Royce, tell me, with the United States pulling back, I mean, we are having this sort of show, we're going to broker peace, but realistically, they have pulled back tremendously. Is there going to be anyone definitively outside of Africa who has control over any part of what goes on, or is it just going to continue to be a fun fight and everybody and anyone is going to be involved?
In Africa?
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, as I said, I think Mali is now thoroughly in Russia's pocket. So is the CAR, the Central African Republic. In fact, the Central African Republic, I don't know if you know this, just to show you, it's a flag. To go to university, you have to now learn Russian in the Central African Republic.
Wow.
And they've already built an Orthodox church in Russia, and they're getting their first converts. Going back to our topic earlier about the Russian Orthodox Church. So this is how embedded into the CAR the Russians are at this point. And then you've got the Sahel with Niger. Chad is kind of iffy, and Burkina Faso, I think, is in Russia's pocket. And then you've got the Chinese. The Chinese are always there. They're also giving, by the way, Burkina Faso, Mali, they're also giving arms to them and weapon systems too, and whatever defense systems, including vehicles to win favor and to, in their own way, keep the peace as well regarding some border areas. China's China. It tries to stay out of the conflicts, but will arm many countries in Africa. I think China now is like the biggest arms supplier to Africa at this point.
Biggest investor for sure. I mean, one of the areas that they've been working on is really creating and building infrastructure for electricity generation, mostly solar installation. And the reason for this is they look at Africa as an untapped consumer market. And I think what they're trying to do is build a consumer-based economy out of Africa so that, essentially Chinese goods can arrive into many African countries and subtly, or not so subtly as the case may be, influence the political situation by creating wealth in those economies, of which, the main beneficiary will be China. That's kind of how they work. But I also think what's really interesting is that the pullback of America has opened up a Pan-African opportunity, maybe led by South Africa. But, I think you have some concerns about South Africa's ability to lead, period. But I think that there is a potential opportunity, especially with projects like the Trans-Saharan pipeline that we've discussed on the Ora report before, whether or not the security situation can be, can be fixed. I don't know if that's possible.
That's a good question. I don't know. And you have to look at it case by case, I think,
Yeah.
country to country, region to region, to understand the dynamics, because the dynamics can get quite convoluted and complex. It's complex. Tribalism is a factor, and DRC tribalism is a factor. Rwanda tribalism is a factor. Hutus and what have you. There's no, again, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So there could be a tribal factor, a religious factor, a mix of both that are happening. Mozambique is an example where there's a mix of, where you have the ISIS Mozambique movement, but it's also tribally attached to Muslim tribes within southern Tanzania and tribes within Mozambique. It gets complicated. Again, you have to look, I think, at every situation in context, specifically to figure out what could be done to bring about peace. Not all African countries are at war either, but yeah, there's a propensity to conflict. Look at Sahel. There's that Islamist factor that's at play, and also tribalism. The Tuareg have gone to war against the government of Mali. By the way, they went to war because Goita kicked out the United Nations, probably at the behest of the Russians. And so the Tuareg were, we hate the Russians, and they went back to war because the UN got kicked out. So they brought, by the way, footnote, kind of off topic from the question. I've often said, why does anyone hire a Wagner group when they've had zero success?
Yeah.
Zero. They've had no success anywhere.
No references. 1 star on Yelp.
Yeah. Well, Bakhmut is the first mercenary army to win a battle against an army in probably a couple of centuries, where they took Bakhmut. But other than that, in Africa, it's when they first showed up in Mozambique a few years ago after Dyke Advisory Group left, when they showed up with a couple of helicopters and 200 men, they didn't last.
No.
They didn't last. And I remember they ran away with their tails between their legs. After 10 of their men were captured and beheaded, I know from the inside that 40 of them, of the 200 men, went to their commanders and said, we want to go home.
So, yeah, that's going to be a bit of a morale kill.
Yeah, but this was early days Wagner. But they have no experience in Bush War, where you had the DAG, who had Rhodesian veterans and what have you, were basically destroying these terrorists and keeping them at bay. With 2 light helicopters, 2 light aircraft, and 34, 36 men. Crazy. The Russians going with 200 in a Hind helicopter and God knows what, and they couldn't handle it.
I want to agree with you over there, because I remember with Angola, it was the South African Defense Forces. And then there's this sort of pervasive mythology that has been replaced over actual history, where the Cuban soldiers, these brave Jacobin, whatever you want to call them, communist heroes, revolutionaries, came in and saved Angola from the South Africans. And in fact, that's not what happened at all. The South Africans were told to return to base. It wasn't that they lost the war, they were actually ordered back to base. They were halfway into Angola. But be that as it may, I put actually an extract of a Soviet handler, and he is talking about how they just could not train up the forces to fight against the South Africans. And he specifically references the Buffaloes, which is Battalion 3-2. You might know about them, Royce.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he said, if they hear the Buffaloes are in the area, they drop their weapons and they run. This is the Soviet handler, Igor, quoted directly. I can actually find the clip. So yeah, they don't do so well over here. And you're absolutely right about the tribal violence. I actually want to it's a hybrid question observation, and it's about how things are reported and the lack of reality and the distortion of the narrative. So going back to university a very long time ago for me, I remember there was a fellow student who used to run every day, and he used to put weights in his backpack. I didn't know him well. One day we were sitting in between in a break, and I said to him, "Why do you run so much?" And he said, "Well, I can't sleep. I have nightmares." And I said, "Why?" And he said he had been drafted, well, he was obviously conscription in those days, and then he had been called up into the reserves for the state of emergency in South Africa. And he said, "You don't understand. We have to go into the townships, and would be black areas, sort of designated as such. And the whole point that what they were doing over there was it was to prevent the kangaroo court and the necklacing. So they were having these, and this is what people don't understand. It wasn't black against white in those days. This was black on black violence. And they would attack each other, and then they would have kangaroo court where very grotesque torture devices and so on were employed, and people were killed. And the SADF who went in, he said, "This is what we face. Okay, we get there. There's a kangaroo court going in. Do you think we're going to just go in and stop it? But there's a ring of men around it. And then outside the ring of men, there is a ring of women. And outside the ring of women, there is a ring of children. So we try to go in, and there we have got the press. And the very next day, we're going to have South African Defence Forces attacking women and children." Royce, any observations, comments about this?
No, but I do remember the necklacing when it was going on. I didn't know. That's an interesting story. I did not know about that. That I did not know. But I know that, yeah, there was any opposition was killed or tortured. You know that. I mean, that is the example. And there was the tribalism factor with the Zulu and what have you. It's the reality of Africa. Again, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah, man. Yeah, it's just the way it is. People in the West need to understand that.
So I think there's another factor here, and what I see really coming together is, since the global war on terror, a part of your audience, I'm going to say domestic and global stage, is how you can gain and win support for your activities. And I think folks have made a careful study about media manipulation and disinformation and misinformation in part of their policies, but also now they've operationalized it, right? Like the tipping off of the media is now, I think, a strategic playbook activity for when you need to paint either your opposition or the rebel group in a bad light, right? And I think it highly manipulative, and we've seen this like play out on the grand scale of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, where disinformation, misinformation is weaponized by both sides almost continuously. You know, there's a small little hack in Ukraine was trumpeting it as the biggest penetration of Russian, nuclear secrets in ever, right? So it's all about how you can kind of, you manipulate the headline. I think this is going on in countries, especially like Africa, to good effect, where the average, I'm going to say, education of the person is much lower. And therefore, the more grandiose, the more outrageous is the equivalent of, clicks and likes and shares. But a lot of the rumors that spread through Africa are word of mouth from, the influencers, if you will. Everybody seems to have a cell phone. And that can be used and manipulated, I think, with somebody that understands who their audience is and what they want to happen. And I go back to the famous UN kind of, where we sat on the sidelines and let the events of Rwanda and the massacre between the Hutus and the I can't remember the
Tutsi.
other group, the Tutsi. You're right. The Tutsi, I think it was. Yeah.
Tutsi.
Yeah. That massacre that occurred, and that was driven basically by propaganda. And so I think, the right message at precisely the wrong time can elicit a major effect on those on the ground activities and recruit people to your cause.
Well, yeah, I think that's just a given at this point. There's a couple of reports I saw recently from about the Sahel alone regarding what you're saying, where there's been a massive propaganda play going on. Traore and Burkina Faso is using it extensively, and the Russians. Wagner Group, by the way, had a propaganda department. So I
Oh, there you go.
imagine the Africa Corps also has a propaganda department because, as I said, I think it's just a rebranding of the company. But Mali and Burkina Faso, there were a couple of reports I was reading, and Nigeria, I think, to an extent, but particularly Burkina Faso, how propaganda is so heavily used, and the Russians are working it. They're helping him, and this is going to happen. This is just human nature. I think part of our human existence, where you hear something and you believe it. Like the blood libel for Jews. People want to believe that. They kill little boys to get their blood to make matzah. It's like, well, matzah's a bread. Why would you need blood? But anyway, a bit of logic comes into play. But unfortunately, people are people. They'll believe what they want to believe. Look, the most educated people in the West are propagating such nonsense regarding, for example, the Middle East and Israel. It is anti-Semitic. The Protocol of Zion is basically being declared by very educated people as a thing. It's happening. It's human
The
nature.
Protocol of Zion, I believe that was actually invented by the Tsar's secret police.
Yeah, it's just it's a story.
Because
Yeah.
now everybody seems to have sort of cottoned onto it.
Yeah, because people want to believe what they want to believe, and it's just it's just human nature and the psychology of humans, especially groupthink or talking about tribe, your group, your people against whomever. And despite being in an age of where information is readily available, people believe the nonsense. I mean, for goodness sake, we have people who believe the world is flat. These are educated people.
And the Jewish space lasers were responsible for all sorts of natural disasters that the United States.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Look, when I lived in Cairo, their conspiracies were a dime a dozen. But I remember one where Sharon at the time had a button that he could push that would create earthquakes in Cairo. It's like, wow, that's pretty powerful. That's that's power.
Why didn't he use it?
Well, we would have the odd little earthquake in Cairo. There was a big one in '92, by the way, that did cause destruction. And yeah, of course, it's the Israelis. Of course. Oh, and there was a great one was the Israelis had put a gas in the air and put a chewing gum on the market that made adolescent girls horny. And you go, okay, what's the point of that? Even if that were true. It's the soul and the virtue of Egyptian women. Okay, and to what end?
Yeah.
It's absolutely bizarre. I actually wanted to ask you, Royce, because Dan sent me something about, the journalists being killed in Gaza. And my goodness me, I have to say, just doing the math and looking at how many aid workers, hospitals, journalists, doctors, UN people there are in Gaza, it is so disproportionate to the amount of territory that they must have thousands of journalists per square kilometer of Gaza. I've never, every second person is one of these. Do you have anything to add about what people are saying the IDF are doing as opposed to what is really happening with Israel and Gaza?
If you're going to talk about journalism, I can give you a firsthand account where in 2002, I was in the West Bank during Operation Defensive Shield. And I did some phone reports at the time. And it was just a quick little gig that I did. Then I left. But the thing I noticed, to put things in perspective, which is what's happening in Gaza, was a lot of these stringers for CNN and other Western news outlets were locals, Palestinians. So what happens is you have, of course, this bias is going to come through because they're from there. There was one Palestinian I remember we were dealing with and spoke with and met with, who was as objective as you would ever find. And he was a unicorn. It was amazing to speak to this Palestinian who understood that there was a non-objective approach by other colleagues who were journalists and Palestinians who were working as stringers. He knew that. I remember him openly talking about it. He said, but he tried to be objective. I forget who he was working for. But there's no escaping this. If you're going to have Al Jazeera, as we know, for example, the journalist who were actually one who had hostages in his house, it's dirty. It's so wrong and it's malevolent. It's very malevolent. But if you have an ideology that sanctions deception as being okay, this is what you're going to have. Again, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah.
What is the problem with the West? Why are they so eager to believe the absolute worst and totally dismissive of any evidence to the contrary?
Because I think there's with some, I think there are many reasons, but with some, there's an innate hate that does exist. There is this hate of Israel or this hate of Jews. The anti-Semitism is a factor, but also Westerners today like to virtue signal for who they think is the underdog. So if they, the poor Palestinians in Gaza, they're suffering and what have you, so they're the underdog, so they must be right. Which is a very warped way of looking at things. I mean, Germany got bombed to heck during World War II. Does that mean that they were the underdogs? That they were wrong? That they were right in some way? Or it just, and people don't understand the nature of warfare as well. What's happening in Gaza is a war.
Mhm.
And to put things in perspective, apparently with the coalition that had fought and the Kurds that had fought in Mosul to take it back from ISIS, I forget how many civilians were killed per ISIS fighter or terrorist. I should use the word terrorist, I think.
Yeah.
But it was quite a few. I think the casualties were quite high of civilians from coalition bombings and attacks. And apparently, proportionally, what Israel has done in Gaza is lower than that. And I think they have a 4-level. I'm using the word level. 4-level system that before they strike a target, it has to go through 4 tiers of approval before they strike something. So Israel's trying to fight this to minimize as best they can, but people want to believe what they want to believe. There's a genocide going on when there is no genocide. As I said, if Israel wanted to commit a genocide in Gaza, they would have done it long ago.
So, by the 8th of October, it would have been done and dusted. I have to agree with you. I've spoken to a couple of IDF via it's an Israeli channel called Al Barak. Among them, I don't know if you know Doron Kaidar. You might have crossed paths with him. I think he's in the States as well, and in security and defense, sort of privately, as well as being in the IDF. And really, he was explaining about their code of conduct and how if any IDF soldier does something out of turn, he will be reported on by his fellow soldiers long before any foreign media gets to him. And generally speaking, I've spoken to a couple of them now. They have no animosity and hatred. For them, it's just, this is what we have to do to protect our families and our future. If this is not a personal issue, this is something we have to do. Whereas if you look at the other side, it is absolutely dripping with venom and hatred. Very different approach.
Mm-hmm. I'll be honest. There are Israelis who don't like Arabs. I'll be frank about this.
It doesn't come as a complete shock, Royce.
Yeah, of course not. Again, I'm trying to be objective about this.
Yeah.
I know the reality of what Israelis can think. And as I said, there are Arabs who fight for Israel as well. The Bedouin and the Druze are an example. a lot of Christian Israelis in recent years have started volunteering, enlisting in the Israeli forces as well. But there is an element of, there's going to be a hate there. We can't escape that. It's just the reality of human nature. And there are Israelis who are going to do things that are going to be unsavory or could be considered legitimate war crimes. They're not saints either, but by and large, it was there was a pundit who phrased it this way: "This is a war of civilization against anti-civilization." And Israel is fighting an existential war for its existence. It was Hamas who attacked Israel, the other way around. They started this war, and now they act the victim when they started this war in the most horrific way, basically with an ethnic cleansing effort. So there's going to be atrocities. It's bound to happen, and there isn't a lot of respect from the IDF to Hamas, and Hamas, of course, just hates Israelis and Jews, and so it can get messy. And so I don't think we should be under any illusions that there aren't going to be atrocities committed by the Israelis. However, you raise the point that the Israelis have accountability. That's the thing, and they have a free press that you don't get from Hamas. So because of free press, especially Haaretz, who's extremely left-wing, and there was that report recently of an IDF soldier who came out and said that it's a killing field at the food distribution points, but there's no evidence of what he's saying happening. But it just shows you it's a free press in Israel. It is a democracy, and there are, if this is true, that there was these killings of civilians intentionally by Israelis, there will be soldiers to answer for it. Those soldiers will answer for it. However, Hamas doesn't wear uniforms when they do their thing. So if there was killings, already I'm hearing that it was because these were Hamas operatives who were shot. These were not civilians, but we'll see. But you've hit a nail on the head. Israel does take a more moral high ground on how they fight this war. A lot of countries would not do this. Look at Syria. 600,000 estimated killed in that war, and Assad didn't care about civilians in towns and areas.
I don't think anyone has ever cared about civilians that much. I think once the gloves are off and once you are in the sort of war situation, then atrocities are bound to occur, unfortunately. That is just the way it is.
It's the nature.
I got to go, guys. I have a call. So I love this. This was absolutely amazing. Royce, thank you so much. And of course, thank you for having me on the Ora Report again.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
An absolute pleasure. And if you would just leave your tab open, if you don't mind, in just so I can upload your recording in case there are any glitches from my end.
You got it. Okay.
Okay. Well, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Royce. Thank you, Ellen. On the tab, both of you.
Okay.